Don't say it again. We will do it again. But there'll be plenty more events like this, sir. Now, you might be thinking, why is a man with the Middle Eastern complexion so proud of the anthem and singing it so publicly? Well, the truth is, I love this country, and it sounds like you do too. It was only so long ago that we weren't able to gather in settings like this. And I think it's important we have a real acknowledgement of country, as we just heard, that pays respect to our fallen soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice for our way of life. My name's Jammal. I run Turning Point Australia. Many of you probably may not know me. Turning Point Australia is a vehicle to educate voters in various ways, including today. We'll be streaming this event to Turning Point Australia's Facebook page, so I do want to also say thank you to Graham Hood, Captain Graham Hood. I salute you, sir. Up! Where are you, Graham? You should be here, Graham. I'll tell you where he is. He's getting ready to do a tour in Victoria and Tasmania and New South Wales. He's an absolute legend, that man. I'd go to the end of the continent for him. Graham has allowed us to also stream this to his Facebook page, so please, while you're here, at some point tonight, be sure to share either the Turning Point Australia stream or Graham's stream so that everyone that couldn't make it tonight can actually see it. I know traffic was bad. I'm a numbers guy. If 600 people in this room, all of you guys, shared this stream, it'd reach 15,000 people. I know metrics and the algorithm, that's just how it works. So please do remember to share it at some point. It's greatly appreciated. Now, we're not the real organisers, Turning Point Australia. The real ones, we're just here to stream this event. Full credit goes to Sasha McNaughton, Kim Warren, and Stephen Tripp. Please put your hands together for them. This event wouldn't have come together without them, and yeah, look, they've totally paid for the entire cost of this event. So if at some point between now and the intermission, actually when the intermission comes around, if you want, please make a donation to them so we can keep doing these things and singing the anthem and getting together and having a safe space for Conservatives, because it seems like we need it nowadays. Now, Stephen Tripp will be announcing most of the speakers tonight. And funny story about Stephen. I think he's having a little bit of PTSD at this venue. Some of you know. So he ran in the federal election in this seat. There was a candidates forum which was set up similarly to this, and he was sitting right there on a panel with about 6 other candidates, including Zali Steggall. And he was basically threatened in this very hall to be kicked out by another candidate, Zali, and the moderator on the stage, who happened to be a former ABC journalist. Now, I know. Be nice, guys, be nice. They tried to treat him like a leper on the stage, saying, and this is Zali, "Excuse me, have you been tested? Did you get tested before you came here?" "I don't think so." Meanwhile, the moderator, who's standing right here, as I said, former ABC reporter, said, "I'm just going to seek some legal advice from the club. What's the protocol? Are you allowed unjabbed candidates?" It's like insinuating that we're going to kick a candidate in our democratic election out of the room. Shame, absolute shame. And I'm very thankful that those days are behind us and that these events are back on again. And I just want to take a second to acknowledge that. Stephen stood his ground, and today he's leading us as the Master of Ceremonies. He will be announcing tonight's speakers, including Paul Vallejo. I know you've got the pronunciation of that, right, Stephen? Yeah, he's onto it. Senator Malcolm Roberts, who couldn't make it. I think he's going to have another grandchild. But he gave us a video to play exclusively first here tonight. And so we're very thankful for that, Senator Malcolm Roberts. He really wanted to be here. Kate Mason, Adam Zahra, Dr. Peter Ridd, John Ruddick, Jeff Grimshaw, and the Honourable Mark Latham, member for the Legislative Council in New South Wales, the upper house. Even if you don't know these names, Stephen will take care of you. He'll be your guide through the night, and I'm sure you'll be very familiar with these names by the end of it, so be sure to take notes. Before I hand it to you, Stephen, I have the great pleasure of announcing our first speaker, former parliamentarian Craig Kelly, who is the National Director for the United Australia Party. Craig was the Federal Minister for the electorate of Hughes for 12 years, and in his time he was an unapologetic advocate and supporter of cheap, reliable and sustainable energy policy. There are many words that one could use to describe Craig Kelly, and a coward is definitely not among them. In my opinion, there are very few politicians in this country that have come under a similar constant barrage of abuse and vitriol. I've seen bits of Craig Kelly's presentation already, and I know you're going to find it both insightful and amusing. Please make sure you turn your phones off. The bathroom, I do believe it's out.
This is actually accumulated cyclone energy. So when Al Gore gets up and talks about the seas boiling, if the seas were boiling, we would see more accumulated cyclone energy. We see no trend. And in fact, the last year, 2022, was the second lowest on record. Again, this idea that there is a climate emergency is an utter furphy. Then we have our friend Guterres, the UN Secretary General. This man is a con man, a liar, as a typical socialist mentality. To stand there, to go to those Pacific Islands and tell those Pacific Islanders you have no future because your islands are sinking is a disgrace, because it does damage to those Pacific Islanders' confidence. The facts are clear. The science is clear on this. Even at a talk like this about 3 years ago, someone was sick putting it in the audience. I hope there's someone doing it tonight so we can educate our alarmist friends. And I said that the Tuvalu and the other Pacific Islands are growing. And the ABC fact check rang down, "Oh, did you say that? Did you say that? We've got him, we've got him." And I went through the data, I went through the science and the work of Professor Kench out of Auckland University. It's exactly right. They couldn't disprove it. So they published it a few days out before, admitting the truth that our Pacific Islands are growing, not shrinking. Now, if I could leave you with that's important tonight. This graph is the number of climate-related deaths over the past century. And it shows that there has been a remarkable 97% decline in the number of people dying from a climate-related death. The truth is, today's generation has never been safer. Today's generation is the safest ever in human history, the least chance whatsoever of dying in a climate disaster. And yet we have an education system that has completely brainwashed a generation of young kids to fear for the future, to think that their future is in jeopardy. Now why does all this matter? Yes, incompetent lunatics like that Chris Bowen, the man whose ignorance is only surpassed by Zahra, Albanese, who has no understanding of economics, the damage that they are going to do to the economic prosperity of this country by signing up to net zero is just absolutely immense. But where it really counts is that we now have a generation of young women and men that are not having children because they have been brainwashed by these charlatans, by these climate grifters. If you want to have fewer children, which one of those kids don't you want born? That's what it's about. We've got people deciding that we would be better off not having more minds. Our young minds are our greatest resource. It has always been that way. And yet we have brainwashed a generation into thinking that we'd be better off eliminating some of those young babies. That's the fight that is before us. We've got to get out there, we've got to be brave, we've got to be courageous, we've got to tell the truth, because the facts, the data, the science is all on our side. It's not on the alarmist side. I know it's unpopular sometimes when you talk about this and you think they love to mock you and heckle you and laugh at you and ridicule you, but there is far, far too much at stake. And that's why I'm committed to continue this fight for as long as I possibly can. And I'll tell you what, I believe there are numbers, and the number of people are waking up and growing and realising that they have been conned by these charlatans. The numbers are growing every single day. So I'll have all these slides up on my social media pages in the next couple of hours. Please have a look at them, share them with your friends, keep up the fight. As I said, we've just got too much to lose. Thank you so much.
Wow, how good was that? Another round of applause for Craig Kelly. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Tripp. I'm from the One Nation Party. It's a pleasure to be on this stage again. I'm really excited about tonight. I feel like coming to forums like this is like going to a music festival. You buy a ticket because you know the headline acts are going to deliver. But it's that obscure band that no one's ever heard of that just gets stuck in your head on the way home. So I can't wait to hear from all the contributions tonight. It may be that one that you're not familiar with that gives you that little piece of information that makes a big impression in your mind. That brings me to Paul Vallejo. Now, I'm really looking forward to this. How many opportunities do we have here in Australia to hear from an aerospace engineer who spent over 8 years at NASA? He's also spent time in Texas universities teaching political sociology and macro and microeconomics. And I have been told on good authority that he is a real guru on nuclear technology. Please welcome him to the stage, Paul Vallejo.
All right, I'm here to talk to you about nuclear power, the good kind. But first we have to talk about the corrupting influence of narratives. Narrative science and narrative news are the opposite of what they claim to be. We all know that there's more than one side to every story, but the idea of a narrative is to make you think there's only one side. Narrative science is a corruption of the scientific method. Don't try to read this slide. We'll go into this shortly. In narrative science, it only cites studies that work towards a predetermined conclusion. And they try to confuse scientific consensus with data and launch ad hominem attacks at people who disagree. Real science doesn't argue from conclusions. Real science is humble. Real science invites falsification. A scientist, a true scientist, who embodied that philosophy was Albert Einstein, who said, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single good experiment can prove me wrong." That is the philosophy you want in a real scientist. Narrative news is similar in that you start from a pre-existing conclusion, usually echoing the talking points of powerful interests. They will find experts to support that conclusion and ignore events that go against the narrative they want to show. So we'll just go through a few of these real quick, and then we're going to get to nuclear power and those narratives as well. We have an expert here who will talk more about the Great Barrier Reef in 2017. These headlines were all over the place. I was in Mexico last month, and diving in Cozumel, people thought the Great Barrier Reef was gone because this narrative news was all over. This was not covered in the news, that the reef, in many ways, is at a multi-decade high. We'll hear more about that later. The Arctic sea ice, same thing, narrative news. In 2013, the Arctic sea ice was supposed to vanish. 2014, Al Gore said that the polar ice cap would disappear. End of the Arctic, ocean will be ice-free by 2015. In 2013, they said, in 2 years, there will be a methane catastrophe as the melting sea ice will release methane into the atmosphere, accelerating the greenhouse effect, and we're all going to cook. What actually happened? 2012 was the low of Arctic sea ice. In 2021, there's been no change in Arctic sea ice for the last 10 years, but you will not find news articles saying, you know what, don't worry about it. It's all, things have stabilized. That's not the way narrative news works. They move on to whatever recent event will maintain the narrative. You won't find articles that talk about it. You'll find maybe some small articles that talk about it, but if you use Google, you certainly won't find it. search engines are also narrative search engines. If you haven't realized that Google is curated search engines, that's something that should be looked at as well. Now let's talk about green energy and the narrative around green energy. There's a narrative and a counter-narrative. Both sides have merit in terms of the arguments. We need to know the best side of both sides of the argument. There's also a nuclear narrative and a nuclear counter-narrative. A little bit about me. Most of this got covered in the introduction, but what I will say is I've lived here in Australia for 11 years. I've been a citizen for about 5. One of the things that people wonder is, like, they ask me what brought me to Australia. And I've traveled to dozens of countries, and what I like to say, and it's true, is that of all the countries I've been to, Australia was the first place I went to that felt like home. I wanted to raise my kids here, and I'm very grateful to be here. It's a wonderful place and a wonderful people, and I'm very grateful. Oh, one other thing that I'll say real quick. My first major uni was nuclear engineering. I diversified that into aerospace engineering. I have not calculated neutron absorption cross-sections in decades. I'm rusty. But since nuclear energy has been banned for a couple of decades, you're not really swimming in nuclear engineers, so you get what you can get. Chemical and nuclear energy are fundamentally different. Every form of energy you see around you comes from chemical energy, the rearranging of electron shells, the breaking of bonds between molecules, whether it's burning petrol or photosynthesis or using batteries, it's all chemical. No is changed in chemical energy release. In nuclear energy, whether it comes from fusion, which powers the sun, combining hydrogen atoms into helium atoms, or fission, the splitting of atoms, whether it's uranium or thorium or natural nuclear decay, the energy released from nuclear processes is far and away of a different class than chemical energy. And this is really important because energy density is going to be a major factor in why nuclear can be such an important opportunity. If you look at all the chemical sources on the bottom, they can release between 10 and 100 megajoules per kilogram, whereas nuclear can release in the millions. Order of magnitudes different. Energy density is a huge factor for nuclear, and it's an opportunity, and yes, it has risks, but those risks can be managed with modern designs. What you want to know for your power sources is, does it have a reliable supply, and is it safe? First, we're going to talk about domestic supplies. Uranium and thorium reserves. Now, most people understand that uranium is the source of nuclear power plants. Thorium can be used as well. The reason why thorium power hasn't been used is that the first use of nuclear reactors was not to make power, it was to make weapons. And for that, uranium was better to be used. So that's why we have a long history of using uranium for power, but thorium can be used as well. Australia is in the top 3 in reserves for both uranium and thorium. I don't know about you, but in an uncertain world, things that my life counts on to be domestic, if at all possible. Magnets for wind turbine blades needs rare earth magnets, and China holds most of that supply. Batteries require lithium, which we do have in abundance in Australia, and cobalt. And in cobalt, 60% of the world's supply comes from the Congo, often mined in what they call artisanal mining. It's not a very pretty process. I think Joe Rogan did an episode on cobalt mining fairly recently, which is a good one to look up. Next, baseload power. What's baseload power and why is that important? Wind and solar are intermittent. Our modern economy is not. Wind and solar, it's the luck of the draw, what you get on that day. Wind's too fast, you have to shut down the turbines. Wind's too slow, the turbines don't spin. Whoops. And demand has to be met every day at all times. Otherwise, you're going to have a blackout. So nuclear can provide base load power, whereas wind and solar cannot. If you are going to use a carbon-free source, and I don't think you need to in the short term, eventually, what you want is stable base load power. the economy has a certain amount of power that it draws at all times. And yes, there are peaks and valleys, but nuclear can provide you consistent power. Whereas wind and solar is a bit of the luck of the draw. And the question is, when wind and solar aren't in your favor on that particular day, who's going to party like it's 1699? Who's going to go without freezers or refrigerators or hospitals that have power? Candlelight dinners sound romantic, but it's not something that is going to work for our modern economy. Next, safety. Modern designs can be designed to be walk-away safe. But our narrative, and what we kind of know from the TV, is we're judging nuclear by old designs. Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, those are all good shows on Netflix. But they were designed in the 1960s, built in the 1970s, and this was the state of art of our telephones at that time. This was the state of art of our personal computers. Okay? We need to judge apples to apples, both sides of every argument. What were examples of commercial power generating solar and wind in the 1970s? Well, you're looking at it. There was none. We have to judge modern designs by modern designs. Advanced reactors, what they call Generation 4, can consume more waste than they produce, and they can be designed to be walk-away safe. What does walk-away safe mean? It means in the old reactors, you had to have active cooling. If the water pumps failed, the electricity to the reactor failed, the reactor core might overheat, and you could have an uncontrolled meltdown. And that's what happened in Chernobyl, for instance, and Fukushima. A modern reactor can be designed so that if, for whatever reason, the cooling system fails, what you have here on the bottom, there's a freeze plug, and the freeze plug is kept cold by the electricity to the plant. The electricity to the plant goes out, the fuel dumps into an energy dump tank, the safety operators can go to lunch and then go camping, come back, and nothing catastrophic will have happened. It's a design issue, and it can be designed to be walk-away safe. Nuclear is already the safest way to make energy. This is one of those things. We have to count our costs on the mining side, on the production side, and then also on the disposal side. An adult in the room has to count all aspects, not just look at the shiny panel that goes on the roof and not where did that silica sand come from and how is it going to be disposed. You have to count all things. Environmental safety. So this is important to me personally. I'm a lot of people love cities. I love the city of Sydney. I like to visit it occasionally. My happy place is on Lake Narrabeen. You'll probably find me there Saturday evening, paddling into the sunset, turning around and watching the moon rise over the lake. It's one of my favorite.
Knowing Senator Roberts, he would have loved to have been here because he is passionate about not only climate change, but also data and facts. And if you were at CPAC, you would know that he really fires up at forums like this. So here it is, One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts.
To this forum's organisers, thank you. To fellow speakers and to all in our audience, thank you. I can't join you in person this evening because our daughter is about to have our first grandchild. In late 2007, I started holding climate alarmists accountable, alongside Viv Forbes. In 2009, I paused and asked myself, why was I doing this? And I unearthed 5 aims. Firstly, protect freedom, for myself, for everyday Australians, and now for our new grandchild. Secondly, restore scientific integrity because true science improves humanity's standard of living. Thirdly, protect our natural environment. Corrupt climate science is killing our environment, not saving it. Fourth, protect our economic security, without which everyday Australians will not have a future. This is vital for humanity's future. And fifth, restore humanity's reverence for and connection with nature's magnificence and rekindle our human spirit. I've researched, investigated, and written extensively on climate science. The end game of unfounded claims that carbon dioxide from human activity causes global warming is clear. It has always been to take wealth, freedom, and opportunity from everyday Australians and to enhance the wealth and opportunity of the world's predatory billionaires. I challenged alarmists speaking out publicly to debate me. Politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, academics, and activists. They all ran away. Entering the Senate in 2016 gave me a chance to speak to our elected representatives face to face, eyeball to eyeball. I wanted those advocating the destruction of our local communities and of our national economy to be accountable for revealing the scientific evidence behind their climate and energy policies. The CSIRO, the Bureau of Meteorology, government departments and ministers have failed to provide logical scientific arguments citing empirical data and observations proving that carbon dioxide from human activity is causing environmental harm. After years in Parliament spent writing letters, making speeches, asking questions in question time and in Senate estimates of CSIRO and of the Bureau of Meteorology, scientists, one thing is now clear. They have no scientific argument to support the failed theory of man-made climate change. They have no data to show humans are causing climate change. And of course, they won't, because climate varies in natural cycles. Last September, I made an 82-page submission to Labor's 2022 climate change bill. That paper is on my website. Today, I'll mention the most important points. CSIRO admitted that it has never stated that carbon dioxide from human activity is a danger. Statements of danger came from politicians. CSIRO has never quantified any specific impact of carbon dioxide from human activity on any climate or weather variables such as temperature, rainfall, droughts, floods, storms, ocean alkalinity. Yet this is fundamental for policy in climate and energy. There's no scientific basis for climate policies. CSIRO admits to not doing due diligence on data or reports it relied upon for external agencies. CSIRO admitted that today's temperatures are not unprecedented. They've occurred before. CSIRO then claimed unprecedented rate of temperature rise, which we destroyed using the papers that CSIRO itself cited. CSIRO has failed to provide statistically significant evidence of any change in any climate factor. It's just normal, natural, cyclical variability. The climate change scam is not scientifically driven. There is no science, it's politically driven. In my submission to the government's climate change bill, I dealt with the history of climate change legislation, which casts a necessary light on this scam's politics. Quote, to comply with the United Nations 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the Howard Anderson Liberal National Coalition government introduced the Renewable Energy Target, the RET. They were the first large federal party to have a policy calling for an emissions trading scheme, an ETS or a carbon dioxide tax. They deliberately bypassed the Constitution in a deal with to steal farmers' property rights to use their own land in order for the Liberal Nationals federal government to comply with the 1997 UN Kyoto Protocol. In doing so, the Liberal National government got around our Constitution's Section 51, Clause 31, requiring farmers to be compensated for the loss of their rights to use their own land. Yet in 2013, 6 years after leaving office, former Prime Minister John Howard delivered the annual address in London of the Skeptical Global Warming Policy Foundation, in which he confessed that he was agnostic on climate science, meaning he did not have the necessary climate science to justify this party's policy and his government's legislation. Thus, the government that started and entrenched climate and associated energy policies did not do so based on science. And further in my submission, quote, when I repeatedly asked the Morrison government Senate leader, Matthias Cormann, for the logical scientific points supporting climate and energy policies, he repeatedly failed to answer my question and instead stated a need to fulfill international commitments and obligations. This is no basis for policy that is costing Australians billions of dollars and will cost trillions of dollars. Matthias Cormann was actually being honest here. Australia is introducing climate change Armageddon not because of the science, instead because unelected, unaccountable, foreign bureaucrats serving the interests of the world's predatory billionaires are instructing our governments. Now, my submission is on my website, malcolmrobertsqld.com.au. It includes a detailed scientific rebuttal using peer-reviewed scientific papers rebutting CSIRO's claims. In the Senate chamber, I asked Senator McAllister, representing the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, to provide me with the elusive, logical scientific points to prove that carbon dioxide from human activity needs to be cut. Senator McAllister responded with these papers. And listen to her, quote, "Here are the 20 most cited peer-reviewed papers about climate change and its effects, compiled by Thomson Reuters, that expressed a view on climate change," end of quote. One is titled "Biological Response to Climate Change on a Tropical Mountain." Another, "Predicting the Impacts of Climate Change on the Distribution of Species." These do not discuss causes of climate change. They're about claimed effects. This applies to half her cited papers. She's scientifically ignorant and dangerous. Let's look at Senator McAllister's so-called proof. One paper specifically questions whether climate variability is actually due to human or natural cycles. 9 of the 20 papers just assumed climate change is real without providing any proof. These are the papers that Senator McAllister said proved man-made climate change was real. 11 of the 20 papers and 3 of her additional 5 papers rely on numerical models, not empirical scientific evidence. Models prove whatever the person paying for the model wants it to prove. Another paper reinforces that natural cycles and oscillations are driving climate variability and admits that climate drivers are poorly understood. It questions whether human activity drives climate. None of the papers Senator McAllister cites and relies upon, nor any member of Parliament or bureaucrat, has been able to provide logical scientific points using empirical scientific data proving that carbon dioxide from human activity affects any climate factors, including temperature. None. This destroys the very basis of the climate change hoax. Why would Senator McAllister cite papers that do not support her claim? It's simple. Senator McAllister has never read them. The journalists that tout these papers as proof of climate change never read them. And the public that shares them around on social media never read them. I did read them because this is what you pay me to do. Where are the papers that prove climate change is man-made? They do not exist. It's a scam. Peer-reviewed papers tell us that there is no discernible trend in severe weather events. These are inconvenient truths for the climate crisis doomsayers, the charlatans and financial beneficiaries. There's no scientific basis for climate alarm, nor for Liberal, National or Labor Greens Pocock Teal climate and energy policy. We're experiencing natural climate variability. There's no reason for shoddy, deceitful policies costing our nation billions of dollars now, growing to trillions of dollars over time. Supposed cheap wind and solar power is a lie. It's a lie that purposely ignores the costs of necessary overbuild, firming, low energy density, unreliability, and the complete rebuilding of our transmission network, which worked fine. We all pay for that. Businesses, large and small, pay for that and pass the cost on to us. Governments pay for that and pass the cost on to us. Right now, in kitchens and living rooms across Australia, families are opening their electricity bills, their gas bills, and having to sit down. Then the panic sets in. How the hell can I pay for this? It will get worse. When the lights go out, the heaters and air conditioners stop, poor and vulnerable Australians will die. These measures are destroying the lives of everyday Australians, small and medium businesses, industrial and extractive businesses, agriculture and tourism. While Australia is slowly killing itself, China is receiving most of the solar and wind subsidies and tightening its almost complete control over the wind and solar supply chain. Please help awaken our fellow Australians to restore sound governance and sovereignty through personal pressure on your MPs and through informed choices at the ballot box. Please support One Nation as we fight back against the madness and defend all Australians from the Soviet-style government of Prime Minister Albanese and the Labor Greens Party. Most importantly, call this supposed climate breakdown what it actually is, a climate fraud perpetrated against humanity. Thank you. Enjoy the forum.
We've already heard a lot of information here tonight, so I just want to draw your attention to the QR codes that are around the room. If you want to ask a question for the Q&A at the end of the forum, just scan that code and you'll be able to submit your question there. Now, our next speaker is Kate Mason. Kate is a community advocate who's concerned about the lack of government and corporate media transparency when it comes to public-private partnership transformations, which are being rolled out in our towns and cities. Kate has an extensive work history in welfare and community development. As a community advocate, she is committed to communities having all the information available to make informed and considered decisions on anything that impacts their lives or their local environment. Please make a very welcome Kate Mason.
Thank you so much I'm so pleased to be here and to speak to you all. So I'm just going to turn, here it is. I'm just going to start with Loonig because I think Loonig is a champion. I'll be speaking about how the climate narrative has been constructed to usher in a new business model to commodify nature, and what this means for us as regular people living in towns, working, being involved in our communities and our families. The starting point to understand is global public-private partnerships. So to paraphrase Ian Davis in a paper called What is the Global Public-Private Partnership? It's a worldwide network of corporate interests, central banks, philanthropists, which are the arms of the multi-billionaire corporate think tanks, governments, NGOs, chosen academic and educational institutions, global charities, unions, and chosen thought leaders. These partnerships control global finance and the world's economy. It sets world, national, and local policy, and then promotes policies using the mainstream media corporations. These government enshrines the global governance into hard policy legislation and law. So that is why we are seeing in Australia that every transformation is the same thing that's being rolled out all around the world. And that is why we see that the largest corporations who are invested in new transformation technologies and markets are also involved in the policy-making arms. They frame the problem and they craft the solutions. So what do I mean by commodifying every aspect of nature under the guise of climate change? David Babson, who is the Program Director at the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, stated in 2019, "The emerging carbon economy is a $1 trillion opportunity according to estimates." And Barbara Basma, CEO of Rabo Carbon Bank, stated in 2021, "It's a bank where not money, but carbon is the currency." So customers contact the bank to buy and sell carbon credits. So to explain a few of the tools through which how they're going to commodify our nature, I'll quickly touch on net zero, carbon offset, carbon credits, natural asset companies, and renewable energy. There are many more aspects to discuss, such as ESGs, but that'll have to be for another time. So what does net zero actually mean? In the words of Catherine Abreu, Executive Director of the Climate Action Network, it means the amount of emissions being put into the atmosphere is equal to the amount being captured. It means that you can release 100 tonnes of carbon in the air, and if you invest in somebody removing 100 tonnes of carbon from the atmosphere, you are then a carbon neutral company. So polluting companies can buy carbon credits. They don't stop polluting. This approach creates a new industry of selling carbon credits. And this new market includes renewable energy systems and carbon capture and storage solutions which don't actually reduce any emissions in practice and are themselves contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So what are natural asset companies? Under the justification of climate change, the New York Stock Exchange is creating a new class of listed companies based on climate and the benefits that nature provides, and it's called ecosystem services. So examples that they put up there include of natural assets are forests, wetlands, coral reefs, as well as working lands such as farms. So what's the issue with this? Well, the wealthiest already own a disproportionate amount of nature and farming land. They will receive the bulk of profit from natural asset companies. They also serve as a strategy for corporates to own and control public common land and water. This equates to land grabs. Countries where the indigenous populations live off the land without land ownership are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Renewable energy is spoken about as being the answer to the climate. It's called clean energy, as the PR focuses on the aspect that it uses the sun and the wind. But what's not discussed is in 2020, the World Bank predicted a 500% increase in the production of minerals such as graphite, lithium and cobalt by 2050. The International Energy Agency states clean energy technologies often require more critical minerals than their traditional counterparts. And to get these precious minerals, human rights abuse is occurring with forced labour of minority groups in China and children working in mines in Congo. So what's also not discussed is the cumulative effect from the whole life cycle of the infrastructure and environmental toxins used in the infrastructure and their effect on land and water. The Green Warriors of Norway raised concerns regarding the increased use of BPA and related chemicals. BPA is in the turbine blades. It's an endocrine disruptor and will potentially end up in our water and food, let alone what it does to the animals. Many farmers are fighting this around Australia, and they're fighting against the turbines and the transmission lines. There are many documented stories of people becoming unwell and unable to live around the turbine vibrational frequencies, and farmers are signed up in secret contracts as host farms where non-disclosure forms are signed. The wind turbines destroy farming land, people's lives and communities, and people have to end up moving off the land, and it then will be bought by the corporates and their affiliates. And the public-private partnerships our government is forming regarding the renewable energy infrastructure is deeply concerning. For example, where I live on the Central Coast, the state government has just awarded BlackRock the rights to build the Southern Hemisphere's largest battery. BlackRock is extraordinarily powerful. It has over $10 trillion in assets under management and is the world's largest money manager. It has heavy, heavy influence on media, finance, banks and governments, and is known as the fourth arm of the US government. So what does this new economy, where carbon is the currency, mean for us, just living normal lives, living in our towns? Well, whilst carbon is the new currency, data is the new gold. This means our carbon usage must be monitored. And this occurs through redefining our towns and communities into smart regions, where the language of equity and inclusion replaces autonomy, human rights, privacy, protections. Equity and inclusion means we have the right to be included in their plans. We do not have the right to opt out. Recently, the area between Wollongong, so through Sydney to above Newcastle and out west to the Blue Mountains, was amalgamated into a region under the title of a 6 megacity. This is being overseen by unelected officials and run through the Greater Cities Commission, which sits between local and state government and is unreachable and unaccountable to the people who live in these towns. On numerous occasions, this 6 cities has been referred to as smart cities, which is a transformation of the way we live, move around and work. SMART stands for self-monitoring, analysis, reporting technology. We will be individually surveilled, tracked and traced inside and outside of our homes. Public-private partnerships are busy working on individual carbon scores. We will be allotted a certain amount of carbon credits which influence where we can go, what we can buy and what we can eat. However, the rich can buy more carbon credits to expand what they're able to do, and those on lower incomes or those who are on middle incomes and increasingly struggling with the crashing of our economy can sell their credits to the wealthier, further increasing the divide between those who benefit from the transformations and those who don't. A massive wealth transfer has already occurred due to the measures implemented through the last few years of COVID. The Daily Mail reported in December 2021 that the top 0.01% of the wealthiest individuals now hold 11% of the world's wealth, up more than 400 billion from 2020. Meanwhile, 100 million people have fallen into extreme poverty. And back to smart cities, we're going to hear a lot more terminology. The Federal Reserve is currently trialling the central bank digital currency, and that'll be trialled. The trial will finish in the middle of this year, but that's being rolled out all around the world and being trialled. You'll also hear about, digital ID, surveillance technology, blockchain, etc. Food systems are being transformed for us to eat in the smart cities. Under a PR campaign of synthetic is sustainable, natural processes are now dangerous and synthetic is going to save us from climate change. And I don't have time to get into everything I'd like to. Oh, I forgot that one. The way everything's just now about carbon and everything else is being ignored. But this is a CSIRO. This actually spells out what's happened to our food systems and what they're implementing with synthetic biology and CRISPR technology, which is where you cut the genes and create new forms of life. You meddle around with absolutely everything. And the whole agenda of the smart cities is that food is going to be grown inside laboratories and off the farms. The reality that makes a fuss, so the elephant in the room, is that to tell us and to make sure that we don't use too much energy, the data surveillance they use to protect the climate is incredibly energy hungry. So in 2020, John Vidal in Climate Change News quotes research showing that the communications industry could be using 20% of all electricity by 2025. And they were only talking about smartphones and gadgets. They're not talking about when they bring in where, every single thing you're doing and your smart meters and every single thing you're using is being analysed. The ecologist.org website stated in 2020 the number of data storage centres worldwide has grown from 500,000 in 2012 to over 8 million today, and it's going to have to increase continually to accommodate 5G and the Internet of Things. So they're using enormous amounts of power to make sure we don't use much power. Surely there has to be a better system that can be put in place. And now I want to speak to the young people. Young people are constantly assaulted with the messaging that the environment is on the brink of collapsing. There's no time and that changes must be made immediately. Now that's a huge burden for a young person to face. Under this sustained fear campaign, they are co-opted into fighting for the agendas outlined above as the corporatised solutions are fed to children as the only way to save them from extinction. And that is actually how they would feel, that they are going to become extinct. And I just want to point, if you've got a young person, we need to get through to them, we really do. We need to help our young people understand that they are part of a massive PR spin, which is very different from caring for the environment. The lovely nature of young people where they're idealistic, and I was a very idealistic young woman, I'm still idealistic, I still search for a better world, but they are being put through a PR spin and they're being and used as fodder. So Corey Morningstar is the founder of the website Wrong Kind of Green, and this is her book, and in it she talks about the manufacturing of Greta Thunberg and talks about the corporate agenda behind Greta and it's all the affiliates and the funders behind her. Because not surprisingly, one teenager did not get worldwide attention from sitting outside an embassy with a sign off her own steam. Young people are also co-opted by so-called citizen groups such as Extinction Rebellion, who are funded by corporates invested in big oil and renewables, so the wealthier are backing both sides. And so to find out more about the funders of the environmental citizen movements, because most of them have been co-opted, go again to the Wrong Kind of Green and you can see the search NGOs up the top. So this is really good resources for young people. A few additional places I would encourage you to go to find out more is Michael Swift's blog, We Suspect Silence, so very long-term environmentalist, very concerned about what's being rolled out. And this is a fantastic article that talks about, because I haven't been able to do all the things that, how this is really rolling out. This is a fantastic article to get the lay of the land. Ian Davis, and he talks about that global public-private partnership, and that is his article on there, and he lays out how it all is coming down from the top. And to understand the bigger picture of what's going on globally and to find out the United Nations influence, which I haven't been able to have time to talk about, the United Nations is behind all of this, behind the Green Mask by Rosa Corey, talking about Agenda 21, Agenda for the 21st Century, and how this is all being rolled out. This is just part of it. So to finish, I assert that until research, studies and data are not paid for by corporates, until our government removes itself from the public-private partnership model, so those who profit are not involved in decision-making, until media is not run and owned by the same corporates who profit from the way the narrative is crafted, or where media can truly be independent from government, and until we can see and understand the cumulative effects of any energy infrastructure, our government has no right to press ahead with these transformations. They cannot claim social licence. We are not aware of what is really going on. And I assert that any model which is going to remove basic human rights to autonomy, agency, privacy, and will instead allow for corporatised, centralised control of ourselves and our families, or land, food, education, information, under the guise of climate, must be refused. We must call for transparency regarding the interconnected industries and governance structures commodifying and controlling every aspect of life. Only then can we truly explore options for living in genuinely non-exploitative ways with nature. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate Mason. Yeah, another round of applause. During last year's federal election, Zahra stepped into the political arena as the One Nation candidate for MacArthur, securing one of the most successful results for the party. Since that election, Adam has joined myself and Rebecca Thompson, who is here tonight as well, the One Nation candidate for Wallandilly, in starting the Ex-Candidates podcast. It is through the podcast that Adam has expanded his knowledge in many areas, particularly on climate and energy, which he has become most passionate. Through the podcast, Adam has gained knowledge from many notable scientists in the field, including Professor Ian Plimer, Dr. Peter Ridd, nuclear physicist Dr. John Harries, and environmental scientist Pamela Jones. Currently, he is on the campaign trail as the One Nation candidate for Campbelltown at the upcoming New South Wales state election. So he's come a long way, so please make him welcome Zahra.
I've been carrying these around all day. The contents of this bag is now one of the deadliest substances of all times. This bag contains the one thing that will end our planet. Al Gore says so. Carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants in photosynthesis. In other words, it is plant food. Why the hell would you want to reduce the amount of plant food in the atmosphere beggars belief? Especially when the atmospheric carbon dioxide level is already so low. Did you know if we halved the level of carbon dioxide in the air as we speak, that all life on the planet would cease? I'm here today not to educate you on carbon dioxide and climate change. We've got so many experts here already to do that. I'm here to ask questions. What do the current brands of government want to achieve by net zero? It certainly isn't making electricity more affordable. Wholesale costs of energy have increased by around 141%, according to an ABC article dated the 29th of April 2022. How does Matt Keane and Chris Bowen explain this? The war in Ukraine?
We have been promised that fake renewables are cheaper, cleaner, more reliable than traditional fuels. Fake renewable output is at record highest at 29%. Keane promised a reduction of $130 and $430 in electricity bills for households and businesses respectively. Liar, liar, pants on fire. We should have politician-powered power stations. We are being sold an increase as a reduction. I guess we really do live in a post-truth world. I've said this 100 times, the sun is free, the wind is free, but to convert it to dispatchable power is not. Is net zero policy here to decrease the cost of living crisis and raise standards of living for Australians? If we look at Germany for a clue, you can see that it isn't true. Under the Energy Wendy policy, adopted 20 years ago, fake renewables have grown rapidly. For Germany to make the transition, it has been extremely reliant on LNG supply from Russia. As we are witnessing, relying on foreign powers for your electricity needs puts your country into a very weak position. In chess, that would be called a check position. Despite rapid growth in fake renewables, coal consumption in Germany has only reduced by 1/3. The juice ain't worth the squeeze. It's important to note that nuclear power alarmists fly the flag that nuclear is the most expensive and volatile form of energy. I ask, how can this be when on average France's electricity prices are 50% cheaper than Germany, living the green dream? Our world in data shows that France is heavily reliant on nuclear energy to meet electricity demands at over 36% supply. Maybe Keane, Bowen and Albanese and the like should look to Germany and learn from their mistakes. Will fake renewables benefit the most vulnerable Australians? To quote Professor Ian Plimer, the push for renewables is making third world countries poorer, and it is also making wealthier countries poorer. We need to look at third world countries to see what they use to heat their homes and cook their food. Dung. Yes, that's right, dung. In India, they use gomaya and komaya, cow pies dried and burned. Imagine heading out to the local cow paddock, jumping the fence, flogging manure to heat your home. I guess you'd call it if Keane and the like really wanted to move to a safer, greener energy source, nuclear would be the best option. Documented by notable scientist James Hansen, global nuclear production displacing coal has saved an estimated 75,000 lives. New South Wales One Nation doesn't want to see Australians raiding cow paddocks for poo. We want to see energy abundance. We should be a global energy superpower, and we know renewables won't get us there alone. In closing, who do you choose to make New South Wales and Australia great again? New South Wales One Nation will fight the government's net zero policies and put it where it belongs, the bin. We oppose the shutdown of Liddell and Eraring in 23 and 25, and will fight to keep the lights on. This rush to fake renewables is certain to cause blackouts. Okay. We believe that we should utilise all energy sources and not pick a favourite at the expense of all others. The Keane-Perrottet energy disaster has created a gap that will need to be filled. We will lift the ban on nuclear and construct another gas peaking plant. We will set aside $5 billion of savings from kicking Green Keane's $10 billion green energy programs to the curb. We will reduce the cost of electricity by stopping the government's $8 billion clean energy economy expenditure and put it back into the pockets of households and businesses. New South Wales One Nation is wise enough to learn from other countries' failures and feel that we don't need to learn by experiencing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Now, if you think Adam has come a long way from Campbelltown, our next presenter has come all the way from Townsville. Mind you, we can't be too nice to him though, because he once told me that Sydney has pathetic coral compared to Queensland coral. In fairness, he's probably the best person to ask. Of course, I'm speaking of Dr. Peter Ridd.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's true. Sydney Harbour has not the most pathetic coral on Earth. That goes to Scotland and various other places, and a little bit of global warming would fix that quite well, actually. So I am going to talk a little bit about the Great Barrier Reef, and I actually don't need to say much more. This is a graph of the amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef that's been measured since 1985, and you can see from that graph that we have record high coral on the Great Barrier Reef. Isn't that a wonderful thing? But what is just completely almost insane are those red dots you see there, because you see those last 4 red dots? They were the big bleaching events, right? 2016, up to 93% of the coral died. In 2017, maybe, I don't know, 50%. More and more in 2020, and then 2022, all that coral had died. And remember, coral is a slow-growing organism. It takes 5 to 10 years for even the fastest growing coral to recover, and we have a record high coral cover. So I'll tell you what that proves. Prove that the reef is going to be fine forever. We've always got to look after it. But what it proves without any shadow of a doubt is that they deceived us on about how much of the coral had died. Now, you can see that dip there in about 2011. That was after a couple of really big cyclones go through, and one of those cyclones killed probably up to 1/3 of the coral on the Great Barrier Reef, and it happened over 2 to 3 days as it tracked down the reef. They are the big killers of coral, and they cause these big cycles crashing down, but now we have record high coral cover. But this is not the only way that our beautiful Great Barrier Reef has been maligned by the scientists. And the bottom of a lot of our problems, not all of them, well, bottom of our problem are the institutions, the corruption of the institutions, but I'm going to talk about the corruption of the science institutions. So we also have our poor farmers up in North Queensland who are accused of killing the Great Barrier Reef by pesticides and fertiliser and all the other things that they put onto their land. And this is completely and utterly untrue. The water of the Great Barrier Reef, that's what it looks like. Does that look like a polluted wasteland? No, it does not. This is some of the most pure water on Earth, and the farmers are being blamed. This is up to 100 kilometres from the actual coast. Remember, the Great Barrier Reef is a long way away from the coast, and yet the farmers are blamed. When you actually look at the scientific data and take the measurements of the pesticides out on the Great Barrier Reef, it turns out that you can't even measure them. They're so low. And yet the farmers now have legislation against them, telling them they've got to do all sorts of things. And they've always been blamed for something that they haven't done. I want to talk a little bit about, because we're talking about climate and energy, I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise. And one of the interesting things about sea level is that it does go up and down naturally with time. And it turns out that in northern Australia, partly because of the way the plate flexes, but also partly because sea level has naturally fallen over the last 5,000 years, that when the Egyptians were building pyramids, a lot of that you see in that picture would have been dry at low tide because the sea level has fallen by 1 metre, and when it does that, it kills a whole lot of coral. So we've actually got less coral now probably today than we had 5,000 years ago because the sea level falls. But you never hear about these sorts of things. And of course we heard from Craig Kelly that the Pacific Islands, they're not shrinking, they're actually growing. This is well known. Coral islands grow because the coral grows, the bits get thrown up onto the beach, then the wind throws the bits up onto the sand dune, and the islands actually grow, and this is actually what's happening. But the sea level is rising at the moment. It's been rising at almost exactly the same rate for 150 years. The sea level in Sydney Harbour, our longest record, has increased by about that much in a couple of hundred years. And we're supposed to be told that this is some disaster. But the interesting thing is that clearly, despite maybe people saying they believe all these disasters, they don't really, and you can tell by one very simple thing. Where are all the climate refugees in Sydney? Because what we should have is all those people who live on the foreshore of Sydney Harbour, you know, those beautiful mansions. Those properties should be underwater by now. They should all be loading their utes as climate refugees with all the belongings that they've still got left over, and their flooded house should be there in the ocean, and they should be all heading off to Penrith or somewhere where, you know, it'll take another 100 years for the sea level to get up to them. But they don't, do they? They still live there, and they're still there in their very wealthy places because the sea level isn't rising very fast. Even if it goes on at the present rate, and it's very slow in Sydney, it'll take 500 years just to grow that much. This is not a disaster. And of course we have all the climate things. Craig mentioned that the deaths are down by 97%. Greenland isn't green yet. It used to be 1,000 years ago. That's what the Vikings called it. Food production is massively up. The Sahel in Central Australia is 15% greener than it was just 40 years ago. All this great news. And then we have another thing. We're at an energy forum. I want to talk a little bit about nuclear. In fact, before I got into trouble on talking about the Great Barrier Reef, I got into trouble up in North Queensland calling for a nuclear power station about 15 years ago, which was quite interesting. And one of the interesting things even then was the misinformation about nuclear power, which we heard from one of the other speakers. We have naturally a huge amount of radiation occurring, right? You're actually absorbing radiation from the Earth at this very instant. It's coming down in cosmic rays. I flew in from Townsville. I got a good dose of cosmic rays coming in. So the actual amount of extra radiation you get, even from a big disaster, is less than the natural radiation. So Fukushima, very little extra radiation. How many people do you think died in the Fukushima disaster? 1. They blew up 3 nuclear reactors. Those Japanese, they did the experiment properly, right? And we lost 1 person. Even Chernobyl, which was a really bad disaster, or a really bad reactor, only less than 100 people died. But you know where a lot more people died from that Chernobyl? It wasn't the nuclear reactor disaster itself. It was the dodgy science which then got out and said that this is dangerous to people even living in Germany. And my host here in Sydney was living in Germany when the clouds went over. The real damage was done because there were literally thousands of unnecessary pregnancy terminations by scared women who thought their child was going to be maimed. And they never should have aborted those children. This is an example of where bad science and bad public policy kills more people, right? So we've killed far more people by the fear of nuclear radiation than nuclear radiation itself. And it's funny, it's one of the things which I always can tell whether somebody's fair income if they really believe that we're going to end in a climate disaster. Whether they really believe that the oceans will acidify and it will be so hot the only place that we might be able to live is down in Antarctica. You just ask them one question. Are you in favour of nuclear power? And if they say, oh no, we can't have that, well that proves they're not fair income. Because if the world is going to end and Bangladesh is going to flood and all the Pacific Islands are going to go under and there's going to be billions of climate refugees, and you're really wondering about a bit of radiation, well then that is pure madness. So at the bottom of the problem, what we have here is corruption in the institutions. I don't think I have to explain that. The scientific institutions, especially the environmental and science institutions, are utterly corrupt. And that diagram totally shows it. If there's only one thing I want you to take away from my talk is that shows that we must have a quality assurance audit of all these major science institutions so that finally we can have some proper science coming out of it and also tell your children that we have record high coral cover. Thanks very much.
God, he's a national treasure, isn't he, Peter Reid? I think Facebook hates us. They've nuked 2 of our streams tonight while you guys have been having a very peaceful night. I've been fighting our overlords in big tech, and I think if we get nuked a 3rd time, I think we get an award or something, or some kind of prize. And so this is why we record things. Thank you very much for the AV support tonight, who's recording and streaming. Absolute legend. This will be uploaded tomorrow night because I hate big tech, and it'll be put on Telegram, Rumble, and where big tech can't reach us. And so, for those of you listening online, thank you for your patience. We have some excellent pamphlets on your seats. I do believe they may have been on your seats or outside. If you haven't gotten these yet, these are phenomenal. I know you don't like QR codes. I hate QR codes. But these are great for the normies because they love QR codes. And these are based on, this is from Did You Know? The creator of Did You Know, Jake, is in the room tonight. Look out for him. He's wearing a little peacemaker emblem. And Jake is, the Peacemakers, thank you also for providing some crowd control today, because where did the protesters go? What happened? Were they all talk? I think so. It's past their bedtime, probably. So these pamphlets are phenomenal. He's got one on climate change, he's got one on smart cities and digital ID, one on climate change, and he actually has QR codes that links to the claims made in these. So it's all evidence-backed. And so I take my hat off to you, Jake, and to your philanthropy and spreading knowledge. So thank you, Jake. Now, again, apologies for starting late. Sydney traffic. Thank you, Liberal Party. Thank you, Labor Party. You can't build anything. We did start late tonight, but I do not want you guys to miss out on a thing. Coming up next, after this 15-minute break, we'll come back at about 9 o'clock, a little bit after 9 o'clock. We've got our excellent Q&A. We've got 8 of our panelists coming up, and I've been looking at your questions. There are some great questions, but there's not enough questions, and that either means they did a very good job in the presentation, or I've done a very bad job in connecting you. So if you want to scan that QR code at some point and submit a question, tell me who you're directing it to as well, and I'll actually ask it to them directly. And other than that, grab a drink, grab a pamphlet, and enjoy the night. We've also got speeches from Mark Latham. We've also got Jeff Grimshaw and John Ruddick, who will be leading it. So if you have to get back tonight, please drive safely. I understand we're streaming it, we've got your back, but you're going to miss out, especially if the stream drops out. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in 15. Ladies and gentlemen, could you all take your seats? We'll be starting in about 30 to 60 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're still standing up waiting for a drink, maybe one of you should stay in the line, one of you should please take a seat. We do have to keep things running. All right, let's get underway. Thank you everyone for sending in questions. I'll be coming to that after our next three speakers. If I could have some quiet, please. Now, for the next speaker, I'm tempted to say that we've shared blood, sweat and tears in the heat of battle, but in actuality, we did a few interviews together and we went to some protests and, you know, we got a couple of fines together. That man's name is John Ruddick. Now, John is a businessman by day and a political party reformer by night. He's the author of the book Make the Liberal Party Great Again, which he wrote with the intention of fixing the Liberal Party and making it more democratic. The Liberal Party's not really listening. John agrees. So at this upcoming New South Wales election on March 25th, he's the lead candidate for the upper house for the Liberal Democrats ticket. Could you all please make John feel very welcome?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so look, I studied history at university, so I'm not going to sort of talk about the science of this issue, but I do want to share a couple of interesting historical anecdotes. So, in 1803, 2 convict ships left London to come to Australia, but they didn't go to the established colony in Sydney. They tried to found a penal colony in what we now call Melbourne. And they were there for 2 months, and then they abandoned it and they went to Hobart. But at that time, a convict escaped. His name was William Buckley. And he thought he hadn't been to Australia before. He thought he could walk through the bush to Sydney from Melbourne. And so obviously he got lost, and he was very warmly adopted by an Aboriginal tribe. And he lived with that Aboriginal tribe, or there was various tribes over the years, for 32 years. And then when John Batman came over from Tasmania to actually formally establish Melbourne, he thought he would get in trouble, but he just walked into the camp. He said, "Look, I escaped 32 years ago." He'd lost control of time, lost the concept of time. And he wrote a very, very interesting book. So he got, the British were actually or the English were very thrilled to have him because he had a very interesting story, and they employed him to improve relations with the Aboriginals. Now, he then wrote a book. And that was a book that sold well in North America and in the Australian colonies and in England and Europe. Now, the reason why I tell you this at a climate forum is that I read that book just recently. And one of the things I found most interesting was he described this episode where he's with this tribe and a great panic breaks out. And it's not just in his tribe, it's in the nearby tribes. In fact, all the tribes are talking about it. They had this religious concept. This is we've worked out he was actually near what we now call Geelong. Their religious concept was that there was a very strong man at the end of the world who was holding the world up with his strength. But the panic was that he was running out of strength, and that everybody all the tribes had to go absolutely out of their way to give him food. So the food was passed from tribe to tribe till it got to this mythical figure, of course. And they had to pass along weapons and everything. And he said, look, just everybody believed it. All the little tribes believed it, the big tribes. They were all talking about, they were gripped by fear that the world would implode if he ran out of strength. And they absolutely went all out to pass the food along. And his tribe went and lived on a mountain out of fear for several months, thinking. And then when the world didn't implode, they thought, oh, look, that must have got through to him, thank God. Now then, William Buckley says, in this little chapter, he says, look, I don't hold it against this tribe for having these beliefs, because these types of witch doctors have cursed mankind forever in all societies. Now, we might think that in the 21st century, we're too advanced to fall for something like this. Okay, we think we can put man on the moon. We think that we built the internet, and clearly, you know, mankind has a lot to be proud of. But we are still human beings, and every other society has fallen for these witch doctors. Now, the story is always different, but there are 4 essential ingredients, and they are that there is an imminent apocalypse. We're not talking about a drought, we're not talking about an earthquake, we're talking about the end of the world, okay, and it's imminent. Now, there's also a select group of people, just a small group of people, who understand what the problem is, and we must obey them without any dissent. The most evil people of the world are the ones that don't obey that elite who tell us about this apocalypse. And we've got to give them money. There's always a ton of money involved in this scam. And they also say, look, even if we do our absolute best, it still may not be enough to save the world. Now, in the 21st century, we're not immune to this irrationality. And in fact, I want to say today that I'm confident that global warming is the apocalyptic witch doctor scam of our time. And we have one advantage. William Buckley says in his book, which I encourage you to read, you just type in, it's a free book on the internet, a PDF, only takes you about 2 hours to read. It's absolute, I think it's the most interesting insight into what life was like on this continent for our fellow human beings prior to 1788. But anyway, we have an advantage that Buckley and his tribe didn't have. We know who the chief scam officer is behind this whole thing. And his name, ladies and gentlemen, is Albert Arnold Gore Jr. Now, some of you might have heard about a medical issue that people have, a psychological issue called Trump derangement syndrome. I have suffered for 23 years from a very similar malady. It's called Gore derangement syndrome. I have been following this guy since the late 1990s. I have been fascinated by him. I have been the pub bore when it comes to Al Gore. I have been, get 3 beers into me at the pub and I will give a rant about Al Gore. Now, he is a brilliant man. There is no doubt about that. He is smart. He's the most significant most influential human being this century. It used to be Osama, but Gore has overtaken him. Every government in the world's talking about this. North Korea's talking about it. Okay, everyone's talking about... Osama used to make videos about global warming. Now, it's hard. I'm going to just give you very quickly, I know we've got other speakers, I'm going to give you a very quick outline of Gore's life story. Now, you will have difficulty finding this on the internet because it's been scrubbed. There used to be a page on Wikipedia called Al Gore Controversies, and that just disappeared overnight, became Al Gore's Awards and Honours. Okay? But where Gore can't scrub it is that when he ran for president in 2000, there was 5 published biographies. I've read them all about 3 times. Now, some of them were friendly, some of them were neutral, some of them were from opponents of his, but you can't scrub published books. Al Gore would like to, but he can't. Now, this is what people need to know about Al Gore. Now, his father was a senator from Tennessee for many years. His mother worked for Franklin Roosevelt's wife. And then Gore was, and his father was absolutely desperate in 1956 to be on the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. And he just missed out. And after that, all the family's political energy was channeled into infant Al, who was 6 years old at the time. And he was a good-looking kid, he was a bright kid, and I thought, Al, your goal in life is one thing. You're going to be the President of the United States. So he goes off to Harvard. Now, what did he study at Harvard? This person who's changed how the public think about science. He studied politics and media. Now, he's good at those things, okay? But very fatefully, he took one course in his arts degree on science, and that was a science course given by Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle was the person who coined the word global warming in 1957. Roger Revelle, I mean, I know the global warming debate is very hyper-partisan, but everybody agrees Roger Revelle was a great man. And Roger Revelle in 1957 organised this international collaboration to see whether the increase in carbon dioxide was increasing the temperature of the atmosphere. People had been speculating about it since the 19th century, but Roger Revelle at the Scripps Institute in California, he said, well, look, we got it. And even the Soviets were on board. They put water buoys all around the world, and it was a very serious study. And the initial data said, yes, it looks as though there is an impact from an increase in carbon dioxide and the Earth's temperature, but he stressed, he said, look, we need to do a hell of a lot of research on this. Okay? And he basically dedicated the next 3 decades of his professional career to this question. Now, in the late 60s, young Al Gore did this one course with Roger Revelle, and he got this little global warming bat and he put it in his knapsack. Now then in the mid-1970s, his father's former congressional seat became available, and there was like what we would call a by-election. And he's only 26, and he said, okay, well, I'm running for this seat of Parliament. Now this is Tennessee in 1976, and he was a Democrat. He campaigned as a Southern Democrat. Now the Southern Democrats are now an extinct species, but the Southern Democrats were hardcore right-wing, too right-wing. These were the people that were in favour of Jim Crow laws. These were the people that were against the Civil Rights Act. And Al Gore, when he campaigned for president in 1976, he campaigned on being anti-gay, anti-abortion, pro-tobacco, pro-guns and born again. And he won. And then so he gets to Washington in his early 20s, and but there's only one mission in his life. I'm going to be the President of the United States. Okay, so then of course, as soon as a Senate position comes up in Tennessee, he becomes the senator from Tennessee. So he was a significant senator in the 1980s. And he was he was a household name in America in the 1980s, but it wasn't for global warming or science or anything. He was a morals crusader against lewd messages in rock and roll music and satanic messages. And he was claiming, he held congressional hearings, Senate hearings, saying that there is backward messages in these heavy metal lyrics, saying that they're encouraging kids to become Satan worshippers. This went on for 3 or 4 years. It was very, very controversial. But Gore and his wife were the Fred and Elaine Niles of America in the 1980s. This is all forgotten, but this is this is indisputable facts. So then the 1988 presidential campaign comes along. We've just finished the magnificent 8 years of Ronald Reagan, and so the Democrats think they can win. Gore runs for president for the Democratic nomination, and he would have been the youngest president. He was in his late 30s, and he actually came third, which was reasonably impressive, but he absolutely embarrassed himself in a very big way because he campaigned on his right-wing Southern Democrat agenda. Tobacco, love it. Guns, love it. The neoconservative foreign policy agenda. The whole lot. No mention of global warming once. But those Southern Democrats, he was sort of like the last of the Southern Democrats. The Democratic Party had moved strongly to the left. Gore embarrassed himself. He drops out and he says, gee, well, look, the Democrats have moved left, I'm going to move left, but I've got to rehabilitate myself. So then in early 1989, he writes this article for the Washington Post called All About Global Warming. Now, this was the time, so scientists had been discussing global warming prior to this. Gore made global warming a household term that was used all around the world in 1989, and it rehabilitated him. The left loved his message because capitalism was bad, because now it was wrecking the planet. So then he was the first senator since John F. Kennedy to write a New York Times bestseller. It was called Earth in the Balance. So it's just like William Buckley's Tribe, Earth is in the balance, okay, the apocalypse is now. And it was Gore was very famous, and the Democrats love him again. And then a little problem happened because his book and all of his public messaging about global warming, he always said, because he's an art student, he's like me, what the hell would he know about science, right? But his get-out was, he says, well, I'm preaching what Roger Revelle said, and is still saying, because Roger Revelle was still alive. And he says, and he was making Roger Revelle out to be like this Christ-like figure, and Gore was like St. Paul. He was like taking the holy message to the world on behalf of Roger Revelle. Now, Roger Revelle by this stage is an elderly man, but he's still very sharp, an extremely respected academic. And then Roger Revelle, after about 2 years of this stuff, he starts to sort of he's getting very uncomfortable being used in this manner. He'd never met Gore. He had been a student, but they hadn't stayed in touch or anything. So then Roger Revelle wrote this article along with 2 other academics. It was called Global Warming, Look Before You Leap. This is in 1991 it came out. And it was a 7-page article. You can Google it. They can't scrub that. It was a very famous document. And Roger Revelle says, look, I have been studying this thing since the 1950s. Look, we've got a hell of a lot of data now. I'm not real sure about it. He said, we still need to do more research. It's such complicated science to understand what's influencing the atmosphere's temperature. But he says, look, please, we do not need to take radical action on global warming, okay? Now, this was kryptonite to Gore, okay? By this stage, he's Bill Clinton's vice president, and he gets asked about it, at the vice presidential debate. One of the journalists said, Mr. Gore, Roger Revelle has refuted what you've been saying. And Gore says, by this stage, Revelle has died. He's just died of old age, okay. And Gore says on live TV, he said, Roger Revelle didn't write that article, it was all a scam, okay? So then Gore becomes the president. Now, the people that he accused of writing the article sued him, and they won. They won a libel case, okay? And Gore had to apologise big time this is early in the presidency of Bill Clinton. And so the global warming thing, which had rehabilitated him, the reason why Bill Clinton took on Al Gore as the vice president was because he was now this hero of the left of the Democratic Party. So they said, come and help me win the presidency, Al. So global warming had saved him, made him the vice president, but now it's this liability. So you know what Gore did for the next 8 years of his vice presidency? He shut up about global warming. Look, he'd been saying it's the apocalypse, okay? It's going to, we'd have to take radical action. Now, he did, to be fair, in 1997, he did help organise the Kyoto thing. But basically, Gore went absolutely quiet on global warming. He talked about a lot of the things. He was full of energy. And then, of course, he wants to run for president in 2000. And he gave a 1-hour acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention. And, this is the guy who would freak the world out 12 years ago about global warming. Global warming got no mention in his 1-hour speech. It was a speech full of all these policy ideas and everything, nothing about the climate, nothing about global warming. He said half a sentence, he tacked it on and he said, and we need to do something about the climate. It was the most vanilla statement you could possibly imagine. Now then, of course, many of you will remember we had the Florida recount, okay, where Gore conceded he had lost on election night, then he retracted it, and it went on for 6 weeks, and it was a very tense moment for Gore in particular, and he lost. Now, then he was very quiet for 6 years, but he was not doing nothing. He was planning the great comeback, and he thought to himself, global warming rescued me in the late 1980s, and it's going to rescue me again. So he comes out in 1986 with his book, An Inconvenient Truth, New York Times bestseller, of course. Now, by this stage, the Iraq war is going real bad for George W. Bush. The media hates George W. Bush. I mean, they hated Trump. They hated Trump more than George W. Bush, but they still hated George W. Bush a lot. And so Gore was considered to be, by the left of the media, as the anti-Bush. So because they portrayed Gore as this great heroic figure who the evil George Bush destroyed. So Gore could get away with anything. Whatever he said went. So he comes out and it's, an inconvenient truth, it's global warming. And it's, we would all remember how it just burst onto the scene. He gets the Nobel Prize, he wins an Academy Award, Gore's walking around the world like he's a Mandela figure, a Gandhi figure, okay, Mother Teresa. And, in his movie, he mentioned the term that was made in 2007. He mentioned the term global warming about 17 times. It was all about global warming. But in 2009, overnight it changed to climate change. Just global warming became climate change. Why is that? Because the world wasn't getting hotter, as we've heard tonight from many better speakers than myself. So now, with all these scams, with all these witch doctors that have cursed all of mankind, it's all about money. When Gore ran for president in 2000, you've got to hand over and tell the authorities what your assets are. He was worth about $700,000. And the New York Times, 10 years ago, speculated that this guy could be worth $1 billion, and that was 10 years ago. And that's the New York Times that was friendly to Al Gore. Now, it's very hard to know what his wealth is because it's basically not in publicly listed companies. But all of these climate credits, carbon credits and everything, all this stuff, okay, Gore's got a finger in the pie of a lot of it. Now, I do want to end on a positive note. We've just come through an extraordinary 3 years in this country over COVID, and I think we all know that exactly the same people that were pushing the COVID junk science are exactly the same people pushing the global warming junk science. Now, I know... I think 3 years after COVID first started, look, nobody's denying COVID was a reasonably serious version of the flu, but they did overhype it about 20 times. They then basically forced vaccines on most of us. The very best thing we can say about the vaccines is that they underperformed expectations. Okay, that's the most generous thing we can say. We know that lockdowns don't work. We know that walking around in the sunshine and going to the park and the beach is the best thing you can do to not get COVID. Okay, so I think the public are starting to wake up and think and to question the established science. Now, if we can keep battering away on the COVID science, which was junk science, it's then quite a simple step to go to the next step. Say, once we've got a majority of our fellow human beings saying, yeah, we were misled on COVID, it's a short step to then say, okay, great, well, guess what? You're being misled on global warming science as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Ruddick. Our next speaker is Jeff Grimshaw. Jeff is the author of Trigger Warming, which is out on sale outside if you want to buy a copy. It is a great book about everything you always wanted to know about climate or about global warming but were too afraid to ask. Only Jeff Grimshaw could come up with a title like that. He has studied a Master's in Information Technology, specialising in artificial intelligence, optimisation and predictive modelling. He is also a former candidate of the Australian Conservatives and the inventor of the Majors Last website, which encouraged voters to put the majors last at the last federal election. Please welcome Jeff Grimshaw.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm just going to start with a couple of questions because I need to gauge what level I'm pitching at. Can you put your hands up if you know how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, either as a percentage or in parts per million? Okay, good, great, thank you. And regardless of whether you know that question, I want you to put your hands up if A, you would prefer to double the amount of CO2, B, maintain it at its current level, and C, halve the amount of CO2. Unfortunately, he gave the answer away earlier. Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's answer that first question. What's the level of CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, it's 400 parts per million, or 0.04%. So let's make an analogy out of the Earth's atmosphere. Let's imagine a sports stadium, say the MCG or the Rose Bowl, fits 100,000 people in it, so 1,000 people would be 1%. So the atmosphere would be 78,000 people would be nitrogen, 21,000 people would be oxygen, argon would be 930 people. So how about CO2? CO2, oh sorry, I forgot. Neon would be 2 people and 1 child would represent helium, methane and krypton in one child out of the 100,000 people there. So CO2 would be 40 people out of the 100,000. So that's, well, 41 people. So that's pretty much 2 AFL teams and all of the referees. Man-made CO2, on the other hand, would be 1 slightly overweight person. Basically this guy. So what we're being told is that we have to ignore the other 99,990 people in the stadium. You have to ignore every other variable, such as the sun, solar cycles, orbital cycles, oceans, volcanoes, cyclical weather patterns like La Nina and El Nino, the PDO, the ADO, the jet stream, the Gulf Stream, clouds, asteroids, so on and so on and so on. You have to ignore all of that, because the entire global climate is controlled by Tubby here. If you believe that Tubby here controls the entire global climate, you might be an idiot. So let's break down the hypothesis of the Hot Earth Society. It goes something like this. Man-made carbon dioxide is a pollutant that causes dangerous global warming and threatens all life on Earth. The solution is to decarbonize and switch to environmentally friendly, cheap, renewable energy. That's the what I call the hypothesis of the hot Earth society. Every single one of these statements is false. So, is CO2 a magical heating gas? Now, I could talk to you all night about the frauds, lies, and misdirections used by the doomers, the ClimateGate emails, the hockey stick graph, the 97% consensus fraud, the altering of past temperatures to make the present warmer, using anomalies rather than actual measurements. But of all the different tactics, the most frustrating and aggravating one is what they don't tell you, the lying and the bias by omission. So here's what they don't tell you about CO2. Firstly, man-made CO2 is a fraction of all of the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's about 4% of all of that tiny amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Its effects are very weak. It's done all the work it can do. It has a logarithmic effect. So all of this apparent warming it does within the first, 0 to about 40, 50 parts per million. So all the warming's already happened. And any additional increase in CO2 is not going to change the temperature in any measurable way. Next, the main greenhouse gas is not CO2, it is water vapor, by a long way. And water vapor largely saturates any effect of CO2, methane, and nitrogen. Next, CO2 does not hang around for very long, kind of like my girlfriend's. About 4 years. That's much longer than that. Yeah, so about 4 years. People seem to mistakenly think it just builds up in the atmosphere and stays there. No, it's constantly being absorbed by plants, trees, rocks, mostly the oceans, and that's what we call the carbon cycle. I know the older people, will remember learning that at school. They don't teach that at school anymore, whilst, they're teaching 57 genders and whatever. So, there's actually only 2 genders. The other 55 are mental illnesses. But yeah, that's the woke Australia policy for you. What? Okay, finally, CO2 is not a greenhouse gas. Neither is water vapor, methane, or any other minor gases. This might surprise you, but the term greenhouse gas was actually coined by the person who first theorized how these gases worked back in the 19th century. And he didn't have the equipment to measure their effect, and he vastly overestimated their impact. And also, by the way, he said that increased CO2 would be beneficial for the planet. So the idea that greenhouse gases warm the planet is wrong. They prevent the Earth from cooling too quickly. They slow down the rate of heat loss to space, and they keep the temperature stable. This is essential to understand. None of the greenhouse gases produce heat. It's impossible. That would break the laws of physics, specifically the first law of thermodynamics. CO2 is not a magical heating gas. Water vapor, which is the main Goldilocks gas, can act as both a cooling break and an accelerant. In other words, it can keep the atmosphere warm or it can cool it down. Likewise, CO2 increases cooling in the mesosphere and the stratosphere way up there, but it slows it down in the troposphere down here. We really have to stop calling them greenhouse gases and use this term, Goldilocks gases, because it's much more accurate, and because these gases keep the temperature just right, and without them, there would be no life on Earth, because we live in the Goldilocks zone, and without the Goldilocks, despite the fact, even though we live in the Goldilocks zone, if we didn't have the Goldilocks gases, there would be no life on Earth. It really is an exquisitely designed system, the Earth. So is CO2 the climate control knob? No, it's not. How do you do the laser? Woohoo! Okay, so here we are at 400 parts per million right now. Oh, look, we're in an ice age. Even if you double it to 800 parts per million, which at current rates would take 200 years, you're still, oh, look, we've got another ice age. If you multiply it by 10, go up to 4,000, oh, look, an ice age. So there is no correlation between CO2 and warming. But notice this as well. The higher CO2 is, all the good stuff happens up here. The Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, was the biggest explosion of life on Earth. This is where the crop plants evolved, here at 5,000 parts per million. And that was about 400 million years ago. Trees evolved at 4,000 parts per million. Deciduous trees at 2,200 parts per million. I sometimes worry about showing this diagram to greenies because they go, oh my God, if we increase CO2, the dinosaurs will come back. But notice this, if we reduce CO2 by just a little bit, as Adam pointed out, we will go into a positive feedback loop where we will kill every living plant, creature, human being on the planet. That's why I asked, anybody want to halve CO2? Because if you do, you would be a mass murderer on a scale of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, put together times 1 billion. Oh, and Gates, sorry. Thank you. He hasn't quite finished yet, though. Okay, so is warming dangerous? No, it's not. Here's where we are at about, that's the global temperature at the moment, about 14 degrees C. If we drop by just 1 degree C, we're in the Little Ice Age, which was a really, really horrible time to be alive. It was mass starvation, wars, famines. But even if we increase a couple of degrees, as it was during the Roman and medieval warming period, these were periods when life flourished. It was, you know, all the best things in history happened when it was warmer. And it's much nicer to be warmer, you know. Who likes being cold? So, is CO2 a pollutant? No. This is what CO2 does. It makes this stuff. It makes our trees and it makes our food. It's not a pollutant. It is food for plants. And the more we have of it, the more food we will have, the faster it will grow. Now, you've probably seen pictures like this. You see them on the news. And these pictures and the videos are run alongside alarmist, catastrophic news stories about carbon pollution from the doomers. Well, it's a lie. It's backlit to make the smoke look black and dirty and toxic, and they go, oh, it's carbon pollution. It's not. This is a lie. This is a fraud. This is the same power station taken during the day. It's steam. It's the stuff that comes out of your kettle, the same thing that comes out of your kettle. It is not carbon pollution, because you cannot see carbon dioxide, unless you're Greta Thunberg, apparently. No, it's true. She says she can, parents said that she can see carbon dioxide. So let me show you what real toxic smoke and pollution look like. That is toxic smoke and pollution. From the unrecyclable plastic resins and glues that go into these things. And you know what? It's probably not a good idea to erect giant lightning conductors all over a country prone to bushfires. Or erect these giant fans that dry out the ground in a country prone to drought. What's this? Here's more real pollution. This is toxic radioactive runoff made from the production of a substance called neodymium in Mongolia. Now, the demand for this neodymium and dysprosium has skyrocketed because it's used to make the giant magnets in wind turbines. Nobody likes to see this kind of environmental destruction on this scale. And here's another example. This is over 90,000 trees being felled for wind farms in Queensland. There are 3 other projects underway in Queensland that will fell another 500,000 trees. And then we get to this. The child slave labourers in the Congo, digging around in the dirt for cobalt, the demand for which has skyrocketed because it's used in the big batteries and for the electric vehicles and the battery farms that are being built all over the place to stabilise the grid from the rubbish intermittent energy when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. I guess these are the green jobs that they keep talking about. By the way, do you know these green jobs they keep talking about? They're a complete fraud. Most of the jobs in this country that they say they're creating with these wind farms, they go to foreign backpackers.
not because they pay less, but because they get paid more, and the unions then get the bigger cuts, that money goes into union super, and then when the foreign backpackers leave, the government takes 65% of that back from them, so that money goes into the government coffers, and all of that money comes out of your pocket. So, after seeing that, if you think wind and solar are clean and environmentally friendly, you might be an idiot. So what is going on here? What is this whole man-made global warming scam really all about? Well, it's definitely not about being green. It's about getting green. This is how much money we're spending on climate change annually, globally. About $1.5 trillion. That's the equivalent of 10 Apollo programs, and this is, yes, it's adjusted for inflation. So the Apollo program, 7 missions to the moon, all of the rockets, and all of the research, everything, cost 150 billion in today's money. We're spending that 10 times that in 1 year. It's the equivalent of sending a manned moon mission every 5 days. People will be in an uproar if we were doing that. They got angry after just 1 moon mission, saying, oh, what a waste of money. So, what's happening here? Well, it's called corporatism. It's the merger of big business and big government, which is the fascist economic model, by the way. And what it does is it wears this cloak that it falsely labels the science, and it distracts you with illusions whilst they're robbing you blind of your money and your freedoms. Great example of this is one 4-letter word. Sorry, I actually missed off 2 letters. This is what you call them, the seals, and use dollar signs because that is what they do. So the aim and the strategy of this pair of spivs and the sisterhood of simpletons in between them goes something like this. So, the SEAL candidates are elected and they legislate to subsidise wind and solar with taxpayers' money. The taxpayer money is then invested in projects that just happen to be owned by the SEAL billionaires and their mates. The SEAL billionaires and their mates make billions in guaranteed returns. These returns are guaranteed because they get paid
even when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. That's nice, isn't it? Getting paid by the government to not work or produce anything. What do we call people like that? Oh, that's right, bludgers. And not only, they then build those big toxic fire hazard big batteries everywhere, subsidized by taxpayers, of course, to store a few minutes of power, which they then sell back to the grid when supply collapses and the price per megawatt is really, really high. And they make even more millions. So we pay, all that money comes out of your pockets, and the double-barreled bludgers profit. Then they spend their ill-gotten gains by buying another beachside luxury mansion, because you know the seas are rising. Or another luxury yacht, so that they and the sisterhood of simpletons can sail to the Bahamas and go for a swim and tell you how warm the ocean is. Or they'll buy another private jet and fly all over the world lecturing the plebs why they are bad for wanting to take the family on holiday to Bali on Jetstar once a year. So it's not just this transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the billionaires. There's also the lost opportunity factor. There's so many examples I can give you, but let's take this clown. So this clown and the government that appointed him, I reckon he's cost this country $1 trillion. Because when he said this, our governments went out and every state government built desal plants costing billions. And all but one of them were never switched on because we had floods and the dams overflowed in 2010, 2015, 2021, 2022. Of course, guess what they blamed the floods on? Yep. The New South Wales desal plant was built under the corrupt Keneally Labour government, using our money, of course, and then it was sold by the corrupt Liberal government to a consortium of retired Canadian teachers and a hedge fund that just so happens to be chaired by a former Victorian Labour treasurer. Imagine if we'd spent that money instead building a version of the Bradfield scheme. So getting all that water in far north Queensland and pumping it down, or even using hydropower to get it down here, we would have solved the Murray-Darling Bay issues. The thousands of homes would have been saved from the floods. We wouldn't have had to pay out billions in insurance and clean-up costs. We've had farmers, you know, massive irrigation in land, being able to grow and sell more food, etc., etc. So just that one idiot has probably cost this country $1 trillion. So that covers the environmental cost and the economic cost. So how about the human cost? Well, here again is one example. They infest not just our federal and state governments, but their real power is in local government. And one thing they are notorious for in local governments is banning hazard reduction and creating fire breaks and controlled burn-offs of excess fuel loads. Now, why is this? Well, it's got nothing to do with saving trees, as you saw earlier. Quite happy to knock those down. And it's nothing to do with preserving the habitats of animals. You know, the same people that are happy to fell millions of trees for wind farms and fine individuals $50,000 for removing a few trees around their property so their house doesn't burn down. Well, it's got nothing to do with any of that. See, what happens is when you get these massive builds-up of fuel load, and they're allowed to build up because the Greens ban, you know, removing that fuel load, well, inevitably you're going to get a bushfire started either by accident or on purpose. And that resulting fire will be so absolutely catastrophic that the Greens and that mincing, pencil-necked pillock, Adam Bant, can point at it and go, "It's evidence of climate change! Look at the fires, they're so big, it's climate change!" So, properties are destroyed and lives are lost just so that they and the ABC can get their propaganda shots. 173 people died on Black Saturday because of green policies. To put that in perspective, that's twice the number of Australians killed in the Bali bombing. Green murder. I've redesigned their logo for them. So, what is this all about? Well, it's about power. So you have the greedy gluttons, the billionaire scam artists and carpetbaggers making themselves richer and the poor poorer, and they'll extract all the riches and profit that they can and leave a trail of death and destruction in their wake. And then you've got those lusting after power, the politicians, local, state, national, and transnational, and the WEF, of course, the globalist control freaks using global warming as a vehicle for global totalitarianism. Then you've got the Malthusian depopulationists and their wrath against humanity. And you've got the prideful, self-absorbed, godless narcissists who want to be the hero in their imaginary disaster movie. Oh, look at me, I'm such a good person. Whilst they install their Uyghur genocide panels and collect their feedback tariffs subsidized by the poor through their power bills and drive around in their slave labor electric vehicles. And then, of course, last of all, you have the envious, angry leftists who just want to watch the world burn and will use the global warming fraud as their vehicle to deindustrialize the West and keep the third world mired in extreme poverty. Now, obviously, there's a lot of overlaps and connections through these various groups. And I reckon that if you join all the dots, it will actually become, see, they think that they're in charge, and it actually becomes clear who they are serving, whether they know it or not. All right, so the big question is, what can we do? All right, first of all, realize this. We are not the ones who are supporting environmental destruction, child slave labor, Uyghur genocide, or anything like that. Oh, just as an aside, there's no argument anymore that this has anything to do with reducing CO2 emissions, because between 2016 and 2020, the only country that actually managed to reduce their emissions was America because of the fracking revolution. Even though President Trump pulled them out of the Paris agreements, they were the only country to actually meet their targets because of fracking. And what's the first thing that President Pedo Poopy Pants did when he got in? Sorry, I should use his real name. President Brandon. What's the first thing he did when he got in? He banned fracking. He banned fracking. And by the way, that's also the reason they got rid of Liz Truss. Where was I? Oh, yes. So we're not the ones transferring the wealth from the working people to the woke oligarchs and the neo-fascists. We are not the granny killers. And we are not the ones who are scaring and scarring children and affecting their mental health. We are not the child abusers. In terms of the moral high ground, we're standing on top of Mount Everest, and the cult of global warming are in the 7th layer of hell. They have no moral standing at all. None. So what can we do? Well, first and most obvious is vote wisely. In case I haven't made it clear enough yet, our governments no longer work for us. The majority of politicians are corrupt or incompetent. There's a few who aren't. There's 2 of them sat over there. In most cases, they're corrupt and incompetent. So remove them, vote them out. Liberal, Labour, Greens last. There's at least 4 parties that all have sensible energy policies that are not going to wreck the country. We've become a nation that is, we're a second-rate people, and we're run by third-rate morons, and we're robbed blind by first-rate crooks. We can change that, and we have the power to change that. Next, learn the science. The basic facts and arguments. It's not difficult. It's the reason I wrote my book. To give people the basics that most people learnt at school and they've either forgotten, or as is the case with the younger generation, they've never been taught it, they've been lied to and gaslighted and never exposed to all the facts. What else can we do? Okay, well, speak up and speak out. Get out of the echo chamber. It's no good sitting here nodding in agreement with each other and then stepping outside and zipping your mouth up because you're afraid about being invited to the next dinners and barbecues. We're fighting for the survival of Western civilization here. If you're too afraid to speak to people, just go and sit in a woke cafe with a friend and talk in very loud voices. Go, yeah, I'm not going to help some greedy billionaires and corrupt politicians get richer at the expense of the poor and the exploitation of the third world. Do something like that. So what you have to do is you need to know your audience as well. The people that you need to focus on are these, the fence sitters, the people who are unsure and disinterested. You might be able to get some of the true believers and cheap and useful idiots. I've converted a few of them. You won't get them all. As for the cult leaders, destroy them, because these are the Jim Joneses, the Shoko Asaharas, verbally of course I mean. These are the Jim Jones and Shoko Asaharas and David Koresh's of the whole thing. They are the cult leaders. They need to be just mown down with words. So you have to realize that people have bought into this, and these people, they need an exit strategy. They need something that they can back away from things slowly, So you give them things like, the child slave labor angle, the Uyghur genocide angle, the environmental destruction angle, do the whole nuclear power thing and go, yeah, we should go nuclear. And they'll very slowly back away from it and turn around and hopefully one day maybe admit that they were wrong or they were fooled or deceived. And tell them they've been deceived and lied to. Tell them, because they have. Lastly, stop using their language. This is really important. We've got to stop using their language because you lose half the argument when you use the enemy's language. So stop calling it climate change. It's not. It's global warming. They called it that years ago and then changed it to that so that they could make anything, blame it on climate change. Call them the Hot Earth Society. They really hate that one. Greenhouse gas. No, it's a Goldilocks gas. When you say Goldilocks gas, it suddenly gives it a bit of, oh, yeah, that one keeps us alive, you know. Carbon dioxide. Always refer to it or prefix or suffix as the gas of life, the life-sustaining gas, the essential gas, plant food. Renewables, don't call them renewables because they're not. Povo power, I like that one. Poverty power, because it makes everyone poorer and it's just really terrible quality power. Blackout power, Uyghur genocide panels, child slave labor energy. Fossil fuels, stop using that term because that was made up by a billionaire. Use hydrocarbons, organic fuel, that's a really good one. Organic, because it is organic. Coal, oil and gas is organic. Natural energy, even better. Carbon reduction, well, just tell the truth. You're the carbon they want to reduce. Human reduction, wealth destruction. So, last of all, we need to act. You've got to find something you enjoy and get together with others and run for office or support those who are running for office. Get your super out of corrupt Union Super or any of those ESG companies. Write letters, sign petitions, share things on social media. Confront your kids' teachers and the headmaster. Find out what works, share it with other people. Why are we doing this? Well, because if we don't, then very soon we're going to be run by this guy. Oh, sorry, wrong picture. This guy. Done it again. So, actually, he'd be an improvement because he only wanted to reduce the population by 50%. No. No. Why are they all always bald? I reckon it's a testosterone thing. No. Finally. Yeah, if we don't do something about this, you're going to be eating bugs in the dark, living in 15-minute cities and all the things that were mentioned earlier. And every single aspect of your life will be controlled, and half of everything you already make goes to this corruptocracy that we call the government. And, oh yes, and you'll be happy. You'll own nothing and be happy. Those are their words, you know, not ours. Lastly, very quickly, shameless plug for my book, $30, 2 copies for $50 if you want. You get a free set of postcards out there in the forum. It's got all these lovely pictures in it, and this is the only book on global warming that has Victoria's Secrets models in it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff Grimshaw. They had a bit of everything. So we are running out of time, so we're going to push through because we will start getting charged by the club if we go over. So I want to just quickly introduce Mark Latham, our next and final speaker. He's the leader of New South Wales One Nation, the Honourable Mark Latham.
Thanks, Stephen, to the other guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I should apologise at the start. I'm feeling and probably looking a bit shattered and disturbed by things I've seen on the way here this evening. And it's not just because we're running out of time and the event is running quite late, but I had the misfortune of driving past Brad Hazzard's electorate office on the main road out there, and it brought back terrible nightmares of the experience I had at budget estimates, where he had a staffer sitting behind him with a pile of documents about my life history, all the terrible things I've done in my time in politics, and used the budget estimates to go through them one by one. And I want to reassure everyone here, as I did my parliamentary colleagues, of all the rotten things Hazzard said about me and things I've alleged to have done in the past, only half of them are true. Only half of them are true. And I want to say Brad Hazzard, ultimately, he's a very cruel individual, not only for what he did during the COVID period, but he's a very, very cruel man because he's denying a village somewhere of the perfect idiot. So I've got to get over that mental block and focus not so much on climate, because we've had a lot of conversation about that. I'm not a scientist. I defer to experts like Peter Ridd, who've been trained in the scientific disciplines, but more on energy policy, because that's what we talk about, particularly in the context of a New South Wales election campaign. And as I mentioned, I'm not a scientist. I'm not someone like Matt Keane or Chris Bowen who've got delusions of grandeur that they think they can save the planet. I'm a humble public policy analyst, researcher and advocate, so I'll stick to energy policy. But it does raise an important question in the relationship between climate and energy. Why is Australia bothering? Why is Australia doing this? Because with 1.3% of the global carbon emissions, there's nothing we can do to change the global temperatures. New South Wales, in fact, has 0.4% of global emissions. There's nothing we can do to change the temperatures of the planet with that small base of the carbon contribution. So whether or not you believe in climate change, for Australia, essentially it doesn't matter. And even Alan Finkel, the former past chief scientist and advisor to various governments about renewables, has said there's nothing Australia can do to have an impact on global surface temperatures. So in terms of understanding the politics of it, why are we bothering? It does come down to a very strange phenomenon I've noticed in politics of the God complex. Someone like Matt Keane genuinely thinks, as his ego runs into overdrive, that he can save the planet. Now, what qualifications has Matt Keane got for saving the planet? His past job before he got into Parliament was to be an accountant in Hornsby. Now, we all love Hornsby-type accountants, but I'm not too sure they're qualified to save the world. Chris Bowen was the mayor of Fairfield. That's fine. I was the mayor of Liverpool, but not for a moment have I ever thought I'm going to save the planet. Chris thinks he's doing it from that Fairfield background, and he was a staffer to Carl Scully in the New South Wales Carr and Yemma governments, and Carl's best remembered for producing a 500-page document on the sins of vaccination. I don't think Chris talks about that these days. And Carl Scully was the Transport Minister who could barely get a road to go from one end to the other. So Chris Bowen I don't think is all that qualified either to save the planet. But these guys get a God complex about them that's quite weird. You know, I think of good things before I go to sleep at night. They think of saving the planet, which I just find strange. It's a weird overstretch of what a parliamentarian, particularly at provincial government level in New South Wales, could ever achieve, particularly in the context where China increases its emissions every year more than the Australian total. So it's not really about us. Like most things, it's about China. We got an analysis from the New South Wales Parliamentary Library that for Matt Keane's $10 billion annual expenditure on green energy programs, the $8 billion on rewiring the entire transmission network, what he's doing to close down coal-fired power stations, turn the electricity grid upside down. We got the library to do an analysis of what impact this would have. You know, there's a thing in state politics Perrottet pioneered called outcome-based budgeting. And it's important. You do something, big changes in public life, you've got to understand what outcome can be achieved. What's really going to be the real-life impact on the people? And the library came back and said, for all these things Keane's doing, all this frantic activity out there, announcing some new battery, some new trinket, some new transmission wire, some new pumped hydro scheme, the net outcome of all his expenditure and policy changes on the global temperature is 0.00055 degrees Celsius over a century. Over a century. So maybe his great-great-grandchildren will be the heirs to this wonderful public policy achievement of 0.00055 degrees Celsius in 100 years. That's the outcome that this lunatic is talking about. It's a futile exercise. It's a product of a weird psychological problem where he has the God complex of thinking that he's saving the planet. The first ever Hornsby accountant to ever do so. We live in very, very strange times indeed. Now, the serious point is the real-life impact on people who can't afford these sort of changes. In the Hunter Valley, for instance, there are 75,000 coal-reliant jobs, either directly or indirectly. Singleton and Muswellbrook local government areas, not affluent by any means, 60% of the jobs are coal-reliant. So you go down the average street in Muswellbrook and Singleton, and you go coal house, non-coal, non-coal. This is a level of resource and industry dependence that you rarely find in other parts of the country. And you run the risk in wiping out those jobs and wiping out coal and resource of going down the path of the United States, where they have the rust bucket regions, where they've deindustrialised, where the parents are out of work, the kids are in trouble, the kids are on drugs, and the whole community melts down. And essentially, with this Matt Keane, Chris Bowen agenda, the only new things you'd be building in Singleton and Muswellbrook are Centrelink offices. So this is a cruel policy when it's run by the Teals, who've got so much money. They're engaged in what I call indulgence politics. It's a cruel and delusional pathway to talk about the so-called transition to a clean energy economy. And of course, it's been underpinned by a terrible lie, a terrible deceit, a terrible myth on the people of Australia. Because when they started talking about this 10, 15 years ago, transition to a clean energy economy, what they essentially meant is that the system of coal-fired power along the coast of Australia, in New South Wales it's primarily in the Hunter Valley and Lake Macquarie, where you've got the coal-fired power stations, and an existing transmission system that's wired up mostly along the coastline, because that's where most people live. So they were saying we're going to get rid of that entire system, and instead we're going to build windmills and solar panels in the western part of New South Wales, where you've got the sunshine and the wind is strongest, and we're going to have to build an entire new network of transmission wires to get out there, so that whatever limited power they operate, and obviously there's none when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, whatever they generate, we can get it back into where the people live along the coast. Well, this is a massively expensive process, massively expensive. And when they started talking 15 years ago about transition to a clean energy economy, no one in the political class, least of all the mainstream media, ever asked the obvious question, well, how much will this cost? You don't have to be Einstein to work out it's massively expensive. There are estimates of it costing $200 billion, $300 billion, $400 billion. It's almost unlimited, the sort of cost that we're talking about. And ultimately, to fund that cost, someone has to pay. Matt Keane's not paying, Chris Bowen's not paying, it's the consumers. And that's why for households and businesses, the electricity costs have gone up 100%. Australia used to have the cheapest, the most reliable electricity in the world, and now we've got some of the most expensive and unreliable. So this huge cost is being paid by consumers, and before Christmas, the head of Alinta Energy let the cat out of the bag at a policy forum run by the AFR, where he said, look, in the old system of electricity generation, essentially coal-fired power, to generate $1 billion worth of electricity, today his company needs to pay 8 times that amount to do it through renewables, with all the cost of the transmission wires, the subsidies for renewables, the firming capacity of pumped hydro, the storage of batteries that only run for a couple of hours. So in the old system, $1 billion of electricity generation. In the new world that his company's being forced in, they've got to pay 8 times that amount to generate the same $1 billion worth of electricity. So that's a markup of 800%. 800% markup in their costs passed on directly to consumers. So that's why your bills are going up. That's why electricity and gas have become luxury items in this refashioned Australian economy. And of course, the downside beyond cost is reliability. We've now got forecasts from the Australian Energy Market Organisation, AEMO, and also internal New South Wales government documents that we obtained through the upper house processes of blackouts post the closure of Eraring in 2025. It's a complete disaster for the Australian economy. You can't attract manufacturing, resource, any kind of investment if you can't guarantee companies that will keep the lights on. I asked Premier Perrottet at the budget estimates, much more civil than my encounter with Hazard, well, look, you've got this AEMO forecast and you've got your internal documents saying we're going to have blackouts. The lights go out in New South Wales after the closure of Eraring Power Station in 2025. What are you doing about it, Premier? And he said, I'll have to get a briefing. I mean, the recklessness, the negligence of this is just off the radar. We're talking about the viability of the New South Wales economy in just 2 years' time. And the Premier of the state, when asked about it, a serious question at budget estimate, said, I'll have to get a briefing. I followed up with a question in the notice paper. You must have got your briefing. What are you going to do about this problem? And he then gave a non-answer. And Chris Minns is much the same. I mean, the great scandal of the New South Wales election for the 25th of March is that our two major party leaders are willfully ignoring a looming disaster of their own making in the New South Wales economy, employment, viability, and of course we know who'll be squealing the loudest when the lights go out. The Teals with all their devices and luxury items in their rich homes in Mossman and places like that will be screaming the loudest of how did it ever happen? Well, they'll have to turn on their candle, have to light their candles and look in the mirror to work out the disaster that they were part of. So these are the problems we face. The public policy work is urgent, and I think very much the New South Wales election in March is a referendum on not just the quality of the education system that I talk about in other places, but how we do keep the lights on, how we bring down power bills, and how we have a return to what New South Wales enjoyed, the cheapest and most reliable electricity in the world. How do we get back to that? Well, you've got to maximise the amount of generation. We've got to let coal, gas and nuclear off the leash and have them as major generators of electricity in New South Wales. The more supply, obviously, the more reliable the system in baseload power and the cheaper the electricity. We've got to urgently build a gas peaking plant. My preference would be Bayswater 2 coal-fired power, but the urgent task in the next couple of years means we need another gas peaking plant to go with Curry and Tallawarra. We need to avoid the economic devastation of blackouts. We need to abandon the net zero objective. We need to abandon the transition to the so-called clean energy economy that's caused the problem. And we need to return a large slab of the many billions of dollars they spent on green energy subsidies back to consumers so that we haven't got a situation where next winter pensioners are afraid to turn on the heaters for the cost, where families are looking at a power bill and wondering how they can ever pay it. So this policy work is urgent. It really is the question that most politicians and the mainstream media avoid in the run-up to March 25, but I'd urge you here to focus tightly on those issues and obviously support the parties that have got some answers to a situation that's absolutely critical. We know the situation with climate, but the great unspoken problem is what's happening to our electricity grid and the devastating impact it will have upon the people of New South Wales. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. We are getting very close to the end and being charged about $100 a minute. So I want to invite very quickly for a very fast question Q&A, the speakers to the stage. So that's Peter Ridd, Mark Latham back to the stage, Paul, Craig, Jeff Grimshaw, John Ruddick and Kate Mason as well. And we'll quickly do a quick fire. I've got at least 2 questions specifically to each of you, so please within 30 seconds for each, if possible. But we do have to be out of here strictly by about 10:25, so this is going to be very fast. Beautiful. Where's Peter? There he is. Peter, can you please grab this mic? So the first question's for you. Is the Earth at the beginning of an 80-year event known as a solar minimum? And again, please keep it to 30 seconds if possible.
It's quite possible. There's certainly major cycles which we don't understand, and it's quite likely we're at the top of a particular cycle and we'll move down, and the temperature could easily fall.
Very good. Oh, wow. I'm impressed. Next question's for Mark Latham. Millions of homes and businesses run on gas. Millions of jobs and homes will suffer without it. My question is, why is the government selling it overseas and taxing Aussies? This is from Jaden.
Well, I think the biggest problem about gas in New South Wales is supply. The Baird government closed down coal seam gas industry. I know from where I live at Camden, it was an employer, it was a source of revenue for property owners. It wasn't causing any environmental problems anyone was aware of. But, you know, there's a cult-like element in the campaign against fossil fuels. The evidence goes out the window and the cult demands certain reactions, and from these woke liberals that you've got these days, they dance to that tune. So Baird closed down the coal seam gas industry, And New South Wales has gas supply just 5% of its needs. The rest of it is imported to our state. Santos at Narrabri has been trying to get a major gas well going for 4 or 5 years. Perrottet today had the hide to announce a policy of cutting red tape. That company has been buried in red tape and regulation and development delays at Narrabri for 4 or 5 years at enormous cost. How these companies, well, some of the companies do give up and leave New South Wales and write it off as an investment basket case. But the Santos gas supply should have been running years ago. So we should have New South Wales supplying 100% of its gas without then having to worry about the overseas reservations. Our issue with the reservations, of course, is we don't generate enough gas to be relevant for what we export. We just don't do much at all. So the answer is to re-establish a viable gas supply industry in New South Wales. And you know, it's year 11 economics, isn't it? That the more supply you've got, under the laws of supply and demand, the price comes down.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much. The next one's from Greg. This is for Paul. Considering research in Japan and Korea into hydrogen fuel cells, what role will this play in our energy future relative to EVs?
Sorry, the question is about hydrogen fuel cells?
Yeah, considering research in Japan and Korea into hydrogen fuel cells, what role will this play in our energy future relative to EVs?
One thing that I would say about hydrogen is that a lot of times people say, well, hydrogen burns completely clean, so why don't we use that? Again, where does the energy come to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen? You got to look at the whole cycle from the beginning to the end. And so the idea of a hydrogen-based economy has to include where you're going to get the energy to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. It's one of these things where if you take only the good parts and not the bad parts, you can make unicorn farts out of anything.
Thank you. Question for Craig Kelly. We're way behind when it comes to nuclear power. Nuclear power should be legal. Why is the government still refusing to legalise nuclear power?
Green policy, green ideology, and a Liberal Party that is unfortunately infested by people that are not prepared to be brave enough to stand up for the best interests of this country and would rather avoid controversy. When I was in Parliament, I was the only member of Parliament with a nuclear reactor in his electorate. I used to say that proudly.
Yeah. Thank you. Question for Kate, and thanks for keeping them succinct. With Australia's mass of forestry and vegetation, why are we not already at net zero due to the volume of CO2 absorbed by our country?
That's me.
Yeah.
Look, I can't talk too much to that question because I feel like I would need to study that for about 2 years to be able to answer it in terms of researching. So I've been more looking at what's coming into our communities and how we're being controlled and the corporate structures around it. And that's where I'm at 1 year into really looking at everything. So everything's really, really complex and it takes quite a bit of time. So I'm probably not the best person to ask that question.
Did you want to call a friend, maybe Peter Ridd can help with that? Peter? He's in the middle of a conversation. He's scheming with Mr. Latham.
Sorry, what was the question again?
It was just... We've got an abundance of forestry in Australia. Yeah. Wouldn't you think that, you know, we'd actually be at a net zero?
One of the fascinating things is that there's been a massive thickening of Australian vegetation due to the removal of the Aboriginal burning regime. So, for example, the statistics from Queensland, I don't know about New South Wales, is that Queensland is now massively carbon positive. In other words, there's more carbon going into building thickening of forests than we're actually burning in terms of fossil fuels. There's a hill in Cooktown called Grassy Hill that was discovered when Captain Cook went in there, and he went up there and he named it Grassy Hill. That is now a rainforest, right? That's how much the thickening of the scrub is in Queensland.
Thank you. Question for John Ruddick. What happens if the Green Left get their way? What's their ideal world and why is it so bad?
Well, North Korea, and that is where it will end up. But of course, I am a huge believer that this is just a sort of a delusion that the whole Western world is going through, and it's just a phase, and it will turn. Okay, now I am confident that, now it's not just going to happen out of thin air, it's going to happen because of people like you who get up and roll your sleeves up. Now we've got the magnificent Mark Latham from One Nation, who we all love. We've got the incredible Craig Kelly from the United Australia Party. And Craig, your speech was very inspiring tonight, particularly your last line, say, look, I'm going to give the rest of my life to this cause. So I really salute that. But, we've got Mark Latham. Almost half of this country voted for him to be the Prime Minister not that long ago. And so, Mark has really sacrificed a lot getting involved because he cares for the country. Now, I represent the Liberal Democrats. Now, we all think we've got their own best party. We base it on every contentious issue that we've talked about tonight. These three little parties on the right all agree on everything. When I meet someone from the UAP or I meet someone from One Nation, I feel like I'm meeting a cousin. I feel like we're sort of, we're all good friends. We have our little differences. Now, I don't know what the solution is, but, at the last federal election, which was not that long ago, we had enough votes in every single bloody state to get a senator up. We only got 2 up out of 6. I don't know what the solution is, but I do believe that these very friendly parties have to find a way somehow to work closer together, okay? And that's how we're going to turn it around.
Thank you. Question for Jeff. 30 seconds, please. Who is funding this leftist agenda, and how do we boycott their corporate products?
Well, who's funding it? It's the WEF, the globalists. There's all sorts of people behind this. You already know the names, it's the Rockefellers and so on. How do you disrupt it? Well, from the grassroots, there's so many things you can do from the grassroots to disrupt this, expose it to people. I actually think what we need to do is start getting legal on this and start taking them to court and start getting some court cases going. If there's any lawyers out there who want to do some pro bono work?
Thanks. Question for Mark Latham from Josh. How does one in their 30s who works, enjoys public speaking and debating start in politics? By becoming an independent, joining a party, or some other way?
Well, joining a party is the obvious way of getting involved in politics because you've got an organisational structure around you. And if you're in your 30s and you haven't done it, what have you been doing with your time? Maybe you're out there having a good time, that's fine. But the old Jack Lang used to say this to Paul Keating when Keating sat at his feet in the old Century office there in the city. You might think because you're young you've got lots of time in politics, but you haven't got a minute to spare. You really haven't got a minute to spare. And, I might have these ages a bit wrong, but hadn't Alexander the Great conquered the world by the time he was 29? And our Lord had tried to save it. So if you're in your 30s, what have you been doing with your time? Get active, get going, join up.
Yeah. Kate Mason, I want to go back to you for a second. Someone wants to know about how do we restore trust in science again, considering the assault that's happened on it? Considering the assault we've seen on the last 3 years.
From everything I've been looking at, I think we're completely under a corporatised structure now from the United Nations down through, and then the corporate backers behind the United Nations. So everything's, it depends who funds, doesn't it? It depends who funds the studies and then what the outcomes are, and then how that again is then funded through our governments because of what the studies say. So we have to completely find, we're people on the ground. They're not listening to us. As far as I can see, the politicians are no longer working for us. I don't know how we restore trust. We have to find a way. I think we have to find a way to come together as people. We have to not get caught in a lot of division, and they have created a lot of division. So they've created the vegans against the meat eaters, they've created the youth against the older people. They've completely divided us. The vaccine mandates came in and then it divided us completely. So now the real, as far as I can see it, the real agenda's coming in through smart cities and everything else, how we're going to be controlled. So we have to find a way to keep talking to each other and find the humanity and ask for our government and ask to be that we are the people. These are our lives. These are our lives, our family lives, and we love and care for our communities and our families, and that's where we must come from, because we can't think that we're going to be saved by somebody up top. I don't believe that's going to happen. We're going to have to find a way to come together ourselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for your presentations. Apologies if we couldn't get around to more questions. I'm just going to invite Steve up now to just say a few words of thanks and return the room.
Okay, I just want to take this opportunity now to acknowledge some lovely people that brought all of this together. I'm not going to embarrass them all by bringing them all up on stage, but I do want to bring up Sasha and Kim. First of all, I want to acknowledge Kim, who designed all the amazing graphics on the screen, the posters, running the social media, and basically managing all technical aspects of tonight. Also, I want to mention Sophie, who, with her volunteers, did some letterbox drops to promote tonight's event. Of course, thank you, Joel Jammal and Turning Point Australia for hosting this and live streaming it. And I want to thank all the members of the Life Discussion Group who have volunteered their services here tonight. But the biggest acknowledgement and thank you goes to Sasha. I got a call from Sasha at the end of last year proposing this event, and I tried to talk her out of it. I said it's too hard and you need more time, but thankfully she didn't listen to me. She hasn't done anything like this before, but she's persistent, and sometimes that's all it takes. So she hired this room with her own money. She's not given up, and she's pulled it all together. So please, everyone, can you please stand up and give Sasha a well-deserved round of applause. Okay, so now we're going to have to kick you out because they'll charge us a little bit more money if you stay in here. But thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully we can stage more of these events, and thank you very much.